They say a man ain't truly living until he stops trying to outrun the storm in his own head. Until he learns to stand in the rain, feel it, and then figure out what in hell he's gonna do next. For too many years, there was a man who knew only the wind and the thunder of his own worrying mind, a storm that kept him frozen, paralyzed by every single "what if" the world could throw his way. His name was Frank, and at 48 years old he carried the weight of a factory floor on his shoulders and the burden of 100 unspoken fears in his gut. His work at the stamping plant out on the edge of town was hard, honest labor, the kind that ate at your body but promised a paycheck. You could see it etched into him, in the deep lines around his eyes, in the way his shoulders slumped just a bit, even when he stood tall. His hands, calloused and strong, told stories of turning wrenches and lifting heavy parts, hands that had built a life piece by piece. But those eyes, often distant, seemed to be looking at something far away, something only he could see, a swirling dust of anxiety that kept him from truly being present. He was a quiet man, Frank, friendly enough if you caught his eye, but he rarely started a conversation, like he was always preoccupied, always somewhere else in his head. His world started long before the sun even thought about stretching its rays across the Midwestern sky. The 5 a.m. alarm was a daily jolt, not just of sound, but of the relentless march of another day. He'd roll out of bed, careful not to stir Linda beside him, her soft breathing a quiet anchor in the pre-dawn dark. Every morning was a silent ritual. The quick shower, the lukewarm coffee he'd nurse in his worn mug, the stale taste of last night's worries still clinging to his tongue. The house, tidy and small, held the echoes of his family's slumber, Sarah, 19, away at her first year of college, and Michael, 16, still sprawled in his bed, dreaming teenage dreams. Frank would move through the rooms, a ghost in his own home, picking up a stray shoe, adjusting a crooked picture frame, an unconscious act of trying to straighten out the world before it could tip over. Then the drive. The old Ford pickup, its engine rumbling a familiar complaint, would carry him down quiet, tree-lined streets, past identical single-story houses, each one a testament to lives lived, bills paid, dreams deferred. He'd watch the sky lighten from bruised purple to hesitant gray, feeling the chill seep through the window, a reminder of the raw, unyielding nature of the day ahead. At the plant, the air itself tasted of metal dust and the faint tang of hydraulic fluid. His shift was a blur of repetitive motion, the deafening clang of presses, the hiss of machinery, the rhythmic thud of parts being stamped, moved, stacked. 8 hours of hands-on, back-breaking work that left him physically drained, but his mind, paradoxically buzzing, racing, never quite shutting down. And the money, always the money. It wasn't about getting rich. It was about holding steady, keeping the ship afloat. Tuition bills for Sarah, braces for Michael, the never-ending mortgage payments on their well-maintained but undeniably worn home. Every grocery receipt, every utility bill, every unexpected car repair felt like a fresh assault, chipping away at the fragile piece he sometimes managed to cobble together. He'd run the numbers in his head during the monotonous hours on the factory floor, calculating, recalculating, trying to find a margin, a breathing room that never quite appeared. It was a constant knot in his stomach, a low hum of dread beneath the surface of his quiet demeanor. But beneath the exhaustion, deeper than the worry about bills and the grind of the plant, lay something else, something heavier. It was a fear of failure, cold and persistent, that kept him awake many nights. Frank saw himself as the bedrock of his family, and the thought of that bedrock cracking, of failing to provide, was a terror he rarely articulated, even to Linda. He wanted to give them more than just survival. He wanted them to thrive, to have opportunities he never did. And there was a quieter, sadder truth too, a buried dream that had long ago gathered dust in the corners of his mind. Once, Frank had a creative spark, a quiet joy in making things, not just stamping parts but crafting them, shaping wood with his own hands. There was an old workbench in his garage, littered with forgotten tools, a half-finished birdhouse gathering cobwebs, relics of a passion he'd abandoned years ago, smothered by the fear of not being good enough, of wasting time, of failing to achieve perfection. That was the true battlefield inside Frank's head. The endless what-ifs. What if he lost his job? What if Sarah couldn't finish college? What if Michael got into the wrong crowd? What if? Every potential decision, every fork in the road became a monumental crisis, a trapdoor leading to disaster. He'd spend hours, days, even weeks, agonizing over minor choices, paralyzed by the sheer weight of possibility and the terror of making the wrong move. This constant internal debate left him utterly exhausted, a kind of mental fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. He was present in body but absent in spirit, unable to truly engage with Linda's gentle questions about her day or Michael's excited stories about his latest video game. He'd nod, offer a strained smile, but his mind was always elsewhere, chasing ghosts, fighting shadows. The Frank he was, the quiet, distant man, was a stark, painful contrast to the Frank he yearned to be, a man at peace, a man truly present, a man free from the invisible chains of his own making. The gap between them felt as wide as the ocean, and he hadn't the faintest idea how to bridge it. The alarm clock's rude awakening cut through the quiet dark at 5 a.m., like a rusty blade. Frank would usually be stirring already, a prisoner of his own thoughts even before the first bleary-eyed glance at the ceiling. He'd swing his feet to the cold linoleum, the silence in the house thick, save for Linda's even breathing beside him. Coffee, strong and black, was his first ritual, a bitter kickstart to another identical day. The drive to the factory was a blur of familiar turns, streetlights painting stripes across the worn dashboard. Rain or shine, summer heat or winter chill, the old Ford hummed its weary tune. Each morning, as the steel giant of the plant loomed into view, a tightness would grip his chest. Not dread, not exactly, but a deep weariness that settled into his bones before he'd even clocked in. Inside, it was a world of ceaseless noise, the shriek of metal on metal, the rumble of conveyors, the hiss of hydraulic presses. Frank was part of the rhythm, a cog in the massive machine. He spent his days at Station 7 operating a stamping press, feeding sheets of raw steel into its hungry maw, watching the heavy die crash down and pulling out the newly formed part. Hundreds of times a day, thousands by week's end. His hands, thick and calloused, moved with an almost unconscious precision, years of repetition etched into every muscle memory. Each thud of the press was a beat in the drum of his life, a monotonous rhythm that sometimes felt like it was drumming him right into the ground. Every part he stamped, every box he loaded was a piece of the puzzle. The mortgage payment, Sarah's textbooks, Michael's new cleats, the ever-present worry about the furnace that sounded like it was about to give up the ghost. Money wasn't tight enough to break them, but loose enough to make every unexpected expense feel like a punch to the gut. He saw the numbers on the bills, the shrinking balance in the bank account, and felt the weight of it all pressing down, a silent, suffocating presence that followed him home. Evenings were quiet, built around routine. Dinner with Linda and the kids, the TV murmuring in the background. He'd listen to Michael recount some play from football practice or Sarah talk about her classes, offering monosyllabic responses, his mind already drifting. Linda would catch his eye sometimes, a hint of concern in hers, but she knew better than to push. Frank was there physically, but his spirit was often miles away, locked in a silent war. He'd retreat to his worn armchair, the newspaper spread unread on his lap, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, lost in the swirling eddies of what if. It was those what ifs that truly haunted him, a relentless chorus in his mind. They weren't about the immediate tangible dangers, but the shadows of potential failure, the fear of not measuring up. He saw his kids, bright and hopeful, and felt an immense, almost unbearable pressure to ensure their path was smoother than his own. He wanted to give them everything to protect them from the crushing weight he carried. But the deeper fear, the one he rarely admitted even to himself, was that he was failing them not just financially, but in spirit. He was teaching them by example how to live a life riddled with anxiety, how to shrink from the very dreams that could make them soar. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was utterly silent, he'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, picturing the old workbench in the garage. The scent of sawdust, the smooth glide of a plane across a block of oak, the satisfaction of a perfectly dovetailed joint, memories that felt like they belonged to another man, a younger, bolder Frank who believed in his hands, in his creative spark. That man had once dreamed of building custom furniture, of seeing his creations come to life, not just for his family, but for others. He'd seen the beauty in wood, the story hidden within each grain. But the perfectionism, the fear of not being good enough, had gnawed at him, whispering doubts until the tools grew rusty and the projects lay unfinished. He'd convinced himself it was impractical, a distraction from his duty to provide. But really it was the anxiety, the fear of failing at something he truly loved, that had stolen it from him. That gap between the man who punched the clock and the man who once held a chisel with passion, that was the chasm that swallowed his peace. He carried that unspoken regret, that buried dream, like a stone in his gut, heavy and cold. Every day he lived as the preoccupied, distant man, the further he felt from the one he was meant to be. That buried dream, that cold stone, had settled deeper into Frank's gut in recent months. The house payments felt heavier, Sarah's college tuition a constant, thrumming worry beneath his skin, Michael's future looming like an unspoken question. Each morning, the same tired routine, the same gray light filtering through his bedroom window, signaling another day to simply endure. One particular night, the clock on the bedside table glowed 2:47 a.m. Linda was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. He envied that peace. He hadn't seen 2:47 a.m. from the outside of his eyelids in what felt like forever. Tonight, it wasn't a specific worry about a bill or a mistake at the factory that kept him hostage. It was everything. It was the crushing weight of could be and what if. He lay there, rigid, listening to the house creak, the refrigerator hum. His mind, usually a roaring tempest of future catastrophes, was eerily still, but in a way that felt even more terrifying. It was the stillness before a massive storm, the silent pressure building in the atmosphere. He could feel it in his chest, a dull, aching throb, a suffocating pressure that wasn't quite pain, but wasn't nothing either. It was the physical manifestation of his life shrinking, of possibilities fading. He imagined the next day, the next week, the next year. It all felt like a continuation of this exact moment. Awake, alone in the dark, paralyzed by an invisible enemy. His body was tired, his spirit utterly depleted. He saw himself, an old man, still worrying, still holding back, still telling himself he was being responsible by avoiding risk, when all he was doing was avoiding life itself. His eyes drifted to Linda, then to the closed door that led to the hallway beyond which his kids slept. Sarah, with her sharp mind and ambitious spirit, now navigating college, a world away from his daily grind. Michael, still finding his way, watching him, learning from him. What were they learning? How to be scared. How to live a life half-lived. The thought hit him like a cold splash of water. His anxiety wasn't a shield. It was a cage. He told himself for years that these endless calculations, these worries about every possible pitfall, were protecting his family. That by anticipating every disaster, he could somehow prevent it. But what was he preventing? Joy, spontaneity, peace. He was preventing himself from truly being present. He was so busy bracing for the future, he was missing the now. And the now, right this very moment, was slipping through his fingers year after agonizing year. He swung his legs out of bed, careful not to wake Linda. The floorboards were cold beneath his bare feet. The house felt huge, echoing with his unspoken failures. He walked down the short hall, past Michael's closed door, past Sarah's empty room, an ache in his chest at the thought of her absence. He didn't turn on any lights, letting the faint moonlight guide him through the kitchen, into the utility room, and then through the door leading to the garage. The garage was an organized mess, a testament to decades of a working man's life. Tools hung neatly, but dust settled on everything. In the far corner, beneath a stack of old tires and a tarp, was his old workbench. He moved the tires, tugged at the dusty tarp. And there it was. Not a grand masterpiece, not a forgotten dream waiting to be reborn, but a half-finished side table, a simple piece of oak, patiently waiting for someone to care. It had been years. Years since he'd touched it, since he'd allowed himself the simple pleasure of shaping wood. His fingers, calloused from years of wrenching on machinery, brushed against the rough, unfinished surface of the oak. He found a piece of sandpaper, an old worn block, still tucked into a drawer. He picked it up, didn't plug in any power tools, didn't imagine the finished product, didn't consider what he'd do with it, or if it would be perfect, or if he'd even finish it. He just held the sandpaper, pressed it to the wood, and began to sand. The rasping sound was surprisingly loud in the silent garage, a gritty whisper against the hard wood. He focused on the motion, back and forth, the grain visible beneath the dust, the subtle give of the sandpaper, the very slight vibration in his hand. He wasn't thinking about bills or Sarah's grades or Michael's future or his own perceived shortcomings. He wasn't thinking about anything beyond the wood, the sandpaper, and the small, immediate task of making a rough surface smooth. It was a single, solitary action. And in that moment, for the first time in a long, long time, the storm in his head quieted. Not because it was gone, but because he was finally listening to something else. That buried dream, that cold stone, had settled deeper into Frank's gut in recent months. The house payments felt heavier, Sarah's college tuition a constant, thrumming worry beneath his skin, Michael's future looming like an unspoken question. Each morning, the same tired routine, the same gray light filtering through his bedroom window, signaling another day to simply endure. One particular night, the clock on the bedside table glowed 2:47 a.m. Linda was asleep beside him, her breathing soft and even. He envied that peace. He hadn't seen 2:47 a.m. from the outside of his eyelids in what felt like forever. Tonight, it wasn't a specific worry about a bill or a mistake at the factory that kept him hostage. It was everything. It was the crushing weight of could be and what if. He lay there, rigid, listening to the house creak, the refrigerator hum. His mind, usually a roaring tempest of future catastrophes, was eerily still, but in a way that felt even more terrifying. It was the stillness before a massive storm, the silent pressure building in the atmosphere. He could feel it in his chest, a dull, aching throb, a suffocating pressure that wasn't quite pain but wasn't nothing either. It was the physical manifestation of his life shrinking, of possibilities fading. He imagined the next day, the next week, the next year. It all felt like a continuation of this exact moment. Awake, alone in the dark, paralyzed by an invisible enemy. His body was tired, his spirit utterly depleted. He saw himself, an old man, still worrying, still holding back, still telling himself he was being responsible by avoiding risk, when all he was doing was avoiding life itself. His eyes drifted to Linda, then to the closed door that led to the hallway, beyond which his kids slept. Sarah, with her sharp mind and ambitious spirit, now navigating college, a world away from his daily grind. Michael still finding his way, watching him, learning from him. What were they learning? How to be scared. How to live a life half-lived. The thought hit him like a cold splash of water. His anxiety wasn't a shield, it was a cage. He told himself for years that these endless calculations, these worries about every possible pitfall were protecting his family. That by anticipating every disaster he could somehow prevent it. But what was he preventing? Joy, spontaneity. Peace, he was preventing himself from truly being present. He was so busy bracing for the future, he was missing the now. And the now, right this very moment, was slipping through his fingers year after agonizing year. He swung his legs out of bed, careful not to wake Linda. The floorboards were cold beneath his bare feet. The house felt huge, echoing with his unspoken failures. He walked down the short hall, past Michael's closed door, past Sarah's empty room, an ache in his chest at the thought of her absence. He didn't turn on any lights, letting the faint moonlight guide him through the kitchen, into the utility room, and then through the door leading to the garage. The garage was an organized mess, a testament to decades of a working man's life. Tools hung neatly, but dust settled on everything. In the far corner, beneath a stack of old tires and a tarp, was his old workbench. He moved the tires, tugged at the dusty tarp. And there it was. Not a grand masterpiece, not a forgotten dream waiting to be reborn, but a half-finished side table, a simple piece of oak, patiently waiting for someone to care. It had been years. Years since he'd touched it, since he'd allowed himself the simple pleasure of shaping wood. His fingers, calloused from years of wrenching on machinery, brushed against the rough, unfinished surface of the oak. He found a piece of sandpaper, an old worn block, still tucked into a drawer. He picked it up, didn't plug in any power tools, didn't imagine the finished product, didn't consider what he'd do with it, or if it would be perfect, or if he'd even finish it. He just held the sandpaper, pressed it to the wood, and began to sand. The rasping sound was surprisingly loud in the silent garage, a gritty whisper against the hard wood. He focused on the motion, back and forth, the grain visible beneath the dust, the subtle give of the sandpaper, the very slight vibration in his hand. He wasn't thinking about bills or Sarah's grades or Michael's future or his own perceived shortcomings. He wasn't thinking about anything beyond the wood, the sandpaper, and the small, immediate task of making a rough surface smooth. It was a single, solitary action. And in that moment, for the first time in a long, long time, the storm in his head quieted. Not because it was gone, but because he was finally listening to something else. The rasping sound was surprisingly loud in the silent garage, a gritty whisper against the hard wood. He focused on the motion, back and forth, the grain visible beneath the dust, the subtle give of the sandpaper, the very slight vibration in his hand. He wasn't thinking about bills or Sarah's grades or Michael's future or his own perceived shortcomings. He wasn't thinking about anything beyond the wood, the sandpaper, and the small, immediate task of making a rough surface smooth. It was a single, solitary action. And in that moment, for the first time in a long, long time, the storm in his head quieted. Not because it was gone, but because he was finally listening to something else. He kept sanding for a long time, the moon casting long shadows through the garage window. The oak began to glow, a soft sheen emerging under his rough hands. His body moved on autopilot, but his mind, usually a buzzing hive of anxieties, was still. It wasn't empty, not exactly. It was more like the hum of a well-oiled machine, no longer grinding gears, just running smooth. He felt the weight in his shoulders ease. The tightness in his chest loosened its grip. He wasn't thinking about solving all his problems or finding the answers to the universe. He was simply breathing, working, existing in the quiet hum of the night. And as he eventually laid the sandpaper block down, leaning against the half-sanded table, a new kind of realization settled over him. It wasn't a bolt of lightning, no grand epiphany that would change the world. It was quieter than that. It was an exhale. A deep, bone-weary sigh that came from the very core of him, a sigh that carried the weight of years. "Enough!" he whispered into the dark, the word tasting like dust and freedom. It wasn't enough of the bills, or enough of the worries, or enough of the struggle. It was enough of this. Enough of letting the noise inside his head steal his breath, his joy, his ability to simply be. He didn't know what came next. He didn't have a plan or a strategy or even a glimmer of how he was going to turn this ship around. All he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and utterly liberating, was that he couldn't go back to the way it had been. He couldn't keep living trapped in the prison of his own mind. He had felt the quiet just for a moment, and now the noise felt unbearable. He pushed himself up from the workbench, the ache in his knees a welcome, tangible sensation compared to the formless dread he usually carried. He walked back inside, past his sleeping family, and collapsed into bed, the quiet hum still resonating within him. The alarm shrieked at 5 a.m. Frank flinched, his body tensing, instantly bracing for the familiar onslaught. His mind, like a hungry beast, immediately began to gnaw. Another day, factory, overtime, Sarah's tuition. Michael's car insurance, that weird rattling in the dryer. What if he messed up at work today? What if he lost his job? What if? He lay there for a full minute, the cold dread creeping up his spine, the weight of the world pressing down. It was so easy to fall back into it, like sinking into quicksand. The old familiar pathways in his brain, worn smooth by years of worry, beckoned him. Just let go. Just think about all the awful possibilities. Just be paralyzed. But then he remembered the sandpaper, the oak, the quiet. "No," he muttered, the word a gravelly whisper in the pre-dawn dark. It wasn't a defiant roar, just a quiet, stubborn refusal. He threw his legs over the side of the bed, the cold floor a shock against his feet. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to crawl back under the covers, to stew in the what-ifs. But he didn't. He focused on the next thing, the only thing right in front of him. Putting his feet on the floor, he walked to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. The reflection in the mirror showed the usual tired eyes, the faint lines etched around them, but there was a different flicker there now, a stubborn spark. He didn't try to stop the what-ifs from appearing. They were there, hovering at the edges of his consciousness like vultures. But he didn't feed them. He didn't engage. He focused on the steam rising from his coffee cup. He focused on the precise motion of buttering a piece of toast for Michael. "Rough day ahead, Dad?" Michael asked, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Frank paused, a half-formed worry about Michael's latest history grade trying to muscle its way in. He pushed it back. "Just a day, son," Frank said, truly looking at Michael, at the way his hair flopped over his forehead, at the faint smudges under his eyes from late-night gaming. "Gotta make the best of it one step at a time." He even managed a small, genuine smile. Later, at the factory, the cacophony of machines usually amplified the chaos in his head. Today, it was just noise. He walked to his station, his mind already trying to jump ahead to the afternoon's critical assembly line, to the potential for errors, for delays. What if the new parts don't fit? What if he couldn't hit the quota? He caught himself. Just this first thing, he commanded his racing thoughts. The initial diagnostic check on machine 3, that's it. He picked up his clipboard, his pen. He focused on the cold metal of the machine housing, on the specific gauge he needed to read, on the rhythm of the rollers. He could feel his mind trying to wander, trying to pull him back into the swirling vortex of future anxieties. He felt the familiar tension building in his neck, the urge to check his watch, to rush. But he didn't. He forced his eyes back to the dial, his hand steady as he made his notation. He made sure the numbers were precise. He ensured the levers were correctly positioned. It wasn't easy. Every few minutes he had to consciously drag his attention back, like pulling a stubborn dog on a leash. He wasn't perfect. His mind still strayed. But this time, when it did, he simply observed it, acknowledged the worry, and then gently, firmly brought his focus back to the task directly in front of him. The way he had focused on the sandpaper, the way he had focused on the grain of the oak. By the time his shift ended, he was tired, yes, but it was a different kind of tired. A solid, earned fatigue. He hadn't stopped the worries, no. But for the first time in a long time, he hadn't let them stop him either. He had focused on the cut, not the whole damn forest. And in that there was a quiet, unshakable strength beginning to stir. That strength, though, it was a newborn thing, fragile. It whimpered a bit when the alarm blared at 5 a.m. the next morning, cutting through a dream Frank couldn't even remember, just a lingering sense of unease. He woke up, and the world was still waiting, heavy as ever. The same old worries were lined up at the gate of his mind, ready to stampede. Day 2 felt harder, much harder. The newness had worn off, replaced by the gritty reality of trying to wrestle a lifetime of habit into submission. At the factory, a pallet jack broke down, snarling the flow of parts to his station. The old Frank would have felt the familiar icy dread, the surge of adrenaline, the frantic mental calculations of how this would throw off his quota, how it would push back the whole damn line. His mind would have zoomed from the broken jack to the possibility of a missed bonus, to the kid's college fund, to the leaking faucet in the bathroom. This time the panic still tried to rise. He felt it in his chest, a tight knot. His jaw clenched. But he remembered the sand, the grain of the wood. He took a breath. "All right, Frank," he told himself, the words a silent whisper in the din of the factory. "One thing, what's the one thing?" The broken pallet jack. He couldn't fix it. He couldn't make it disappear. But he could go to Foreman Dave, report it, and ask about an alternate supply route. That was the one thing. He walked, not ran. He spoke clearly, not stammering. And when Dave grunted a response and waved a hand, Frank went back to his station and focused on the backlog of other parts he could process, even without the pallet jack. It wasn't perfect. His mind still tried to drift, but he pulled it back again and again, like a tired fisherman reeling in a stubborn line. Days blurred into a week. He wasn't a Zen master, not by a long shot. Some mornings, he'd find himself staring blankly at his reflection while shaving, the phantom dread of the day ahead already settling in his stomach. He'd almost let a wrong bolt go through on the line, his mind momentarily lost in a fog of potential mortgage rate hikes. He'd snap at Michael for leaving his shoes in the living room, only to realize his frustration was just a misdirected outlet for his own internal wrestling match. Linda noticed something, subtle at first. He was still quiet, still carried that familiar weight, but sometimes, during dinner, his eyes would actually land on her, on the kids, rather than looking through them, distant and preoccupied. He wasn't talking more, not really, but when he listened, he seemed to be there. There was a Tuesday evening, a week and a half in. Frank was tired, bone-weary in a way that had nothing to do with lifting boxes. He'd faced down the demons all day, consciously redirecting his thoughts 1,000 times. He just wanted to sit in his worn armchair, turn on the TV, and let his mind go numb. The garage felt like a monumental effort. The half-finished oak jewelry box for Linda, sitting on his workbench, called to him like a duty, not a pleasure. What's the point? A voice whispered, slimy and insidious, from the back of his mind. You're still worried about money? Sarah's tuition isn't getting any cheaper. This one-thing nonsense ain't gonna pay the bills. He stood in the doorway of the garage, the cool air touching his face, and for a long moment he almost turned back. His shoulders slumped. He felt the pull of the easy way out, the comfort of surrender to the anxiety he knew so well. It would be easier to just let it all wash over him, to be the anxious Frank everyone expected. But then he remembered the fear on Linda's face that night, the way Michael had been quiet lately, the hope in Sarah's voice when she talked about college. He pictured the smooth, unblemished surface of the oak he'd been sanding. He didn't want to live that way anymore. He didn't want to be the old Frank. With a sigh that felt like it came from his very soul, he pushed the garage door open wider. He walked over to the workbench. He picked up the sandpaper. He didn't think about the finished box or whether Linda would like it or if he'd ever be good enough. He just felt the grit against the wood, the subtle give, the faint scent of sawdust rising. One stroke, then another. He fought for it every single day. And every day in those tiny, focused actions, he won just enough to come back for the next round. Days bled into weeks, each one a relentless, grinding repetition of that same choice. Frank would wake, the ghost of anxiety still trying to clamp down on his chest, but he'd refuse to give it the morning. He'd make his coffee, eat his toast, kiss Linda goodbye, and head to the plant. At work, the usual cascade of worries, the tight deadlines, the unexpected breakdowns, the unspoken competition would try to overwhelm him. But he started doing something different. He'd pick one task, just one. Not the whole shift, not the entire order, just the next weld, the next bolt, the next redoubt. And he'd pour everything into that. His colleagues, especially old Jimmy who'd worked next to him for 15 years, started to notice. Frank still kept to himself, but the distant, haunted look in his eyes was slowly receding. He wasn't jumping at every sudden noise, wasn't sighing like a man carrying a collapsed building on his back. He was just there, present in the hum of the machinery and the smell of hot metal. Jimmy caught him one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow, a focused intensity on his face. "You all right, Frank?" he'd asked. Frank had just nodded, a small, genuine smile flickering. "Never better, Jimmy, just focusing on this one." And he gestured to the intricate part he was assembling. At home, the change was even more profound. The garage light, once a rare sight, was now a beacon. He wasn't just sanding the jewelry box anymore, he was cutting, shaping, joining. He wasn't perfect. There were mistakes, splinters, misalignments. Old Frank would have tossed the whole thing in frustration. This new Frank, he'd stop, take a breath, and figure out the next tiny step to fix it. He'd learn, he'd keep going. Linda saw it first. He started talking more at dinner, asking Michael about his day, really listening to Sarah when she called from college. He still had his quiet moments, but they were no longer periods of suffocating internal turmoil. They were moments of calm reflection, of planning the next cut, the next joint, the next small project. She'd find him sometimes, just sitting in his favorite armchair, not staring blankly at the TV, but sketching or just looking out the window, a peculiar peace on his face. He even started whistling old tunes he hadn't hummed in years. The weight that had pressed down on their whole house was slowly, almost imperceptibly, lifting. Weeks blurred into months. The oak jewelry box, once a symbol of his paralysis, was finished. He'd given it to Linda on their anniversary, a quiet offering of his newfound peace, and she'd wept not just for the beautiful box, but for the man who had finally made it. He'd moved on to other projects, a sturdy shelf for Michael's room, a delicate picture frame for Sarah's dorm. His hands, once calloused from years of factory work and gripped tight by worry, now moved with a purpose, a craftsman's quiet confidence. He still worried, of course. The bills didn't disappear, the factory wasn't suddenly a utopian paradise, and his kids still had their challenges. But the worries no longer held him hostage. When a new anxiety tried to creep in, whispering about worst-case scenarios, he'd learned to ask himself, "All right, Frank, what's the next thing? The very next actual thing you can do?" And then he'd do that. He'd send the email, make the call, talk to Linda, sand the next piece of wood. He understood now. It wasn't about stopping the worries, because they'd always be there, buzzing like flies around a summer picnic. It was about knowing what was right in front of him, the one thing he could actually do, and then just doing it. The rest of the noise, you let it pass. You focused on the cut, not the whole damn forest. You focused on the grain, the feel of the wood, the quiet whisper of the saw, and in that focused action, the fear couldn't find a foothold. It was a simple truth, hard one, carved from sleepless nights and sawdust, but it was enough. There are men out there, I tell you, good men, honest men, just like Frank. They carry burdens you can't see, fighting battles every single day that leave no scars on the skin. But some of them, sometimes, they find a way to put one foot in front of the other, to pick up the sandpaper, to make the next cut. They learn that the heaviest burden